Okay, we're live. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Stacy Nell. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission. And today, it's funny, I always wait a couple minutes for the tornado sirens to go. And have they stopped doing tornado sirens at noon in Topeka?
I guess. I don't know. I didn't hear them today.
They didn't go off today. I know for the first several months that I did this show, the tornado sirens would go for the first 2 minutes of the program.
I know they used to not do them during December, January, February. So maybe you get a break now.
Okay. I'll have to start. Now I have no reason not to start completely on time at noon. But yes, thank you, everyone. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by the Secretary of State, Scott Schwab. Hello, Secretary. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Honored to be here.
Good. Fantastic. We only have a half an hour, and I've learned these half an hours go very quickly. So just a little bit about Scott Schwab. He grew up in Great Bend, Kansas, and graduated from Fort Hays State University. Prior to entering public service, Scott was a small business owner and a national sales trainer for a Fortune 50 company in the pharmaceutical industry. He was first elected to the Kansas House of Representatives in 2002. Scott worked to bring local control and funding to Kansas schools, while also supporting free market to strengthen the economy. As chairman of the House Elections Committee, a leadership role he held for 4 years, Scott championed several pieces of election policy to safeguard Kansas elections and the voting process. Scott also served as vice chairman of the House Insurance and Financial Institutions Committee and as speaker pro tem of the Kansas House of Representatives. He has served as the Kansas Secretary of State since 2018 and has just been reelected to a second term. I'm grateful to have the Secretary join us today to discuss how his office administers elections, election security, and the future of voting in Kansas. So thank you very much for joining us today.
No, like I said, honored to be here. Very glad to have the opportunity to talk to your audience.
Good. The first question, since it's a lunch and learn, I ask everybody, what are you having for lunch?
It's interesting you ask. I skipped breakfast this morning. I was coming down K10, and if I'm running a little late, my kids, it's a Monday. They didn't want to go to school. So I dropped them off at school. I was running a little bit late. And so I was going to pull off at McDonald's and just get like an Egg McMuffin or something. And the exit was closed. So I haven't had breakfast yet. So I got here. I had to get to work. So I would imagine I'm having a pretty big burger.
Okay. There you go. No judgments. No judgments. I just had some leftover egg rolls that my daughter made.
Oh,
so there you go.
Now I got to consider that as well. Very nice.
Yeah, Dinnerly. It's unpaid sponsorship type situation, but I love Dinnerly. So my 11-year-old learned how to cook when she was 11. Now she's
fantastic. Mm-hmm. I might have to ask my wife about that because my kids love cooking, man.
There you go.
They really do.
Okay, so that's enough about the lighthearted stuff. Okay. Here we go. All right. So there's been lots of confusion, lots of noise surrounding elections and how they're run in this country and in Kansas, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I know we were just talking briefly before we came on, and there's reasons why I definitely wanted to have you on today, but can you shed some light on how elections are run? Like, what's the procedure from your office? Because you're the state level. Right. And if you have any, any input or any insights on how the county level elections are run.
Yeah, so our office, I'm the chief election officer, and every state kind of has their own little nuance. And I've talked to folks as we campaign, as we travel state and do shows like this. A lot of folks will say, well, why don't we just have one system? Well, the founding fathers were really clear that they thought elections should be funded and administered locally. That way, it's not somebody from DC or somebody here in Topeka. It's your neighbors making sure your vote counts and make sure everything's done appropriately. And other states do it different ways. We have 105 counties, and they're very diverse. What it takes to keep lines short in Wyandotte County is not what it takes to keep lines short in Sheridan County, where they have a fraction of the voters. So each of those county clerks have a process according to the budget their county commissioners will fund to make sure they have a system that works best for their culture, for their county, and their citizens that are voting. We really, voter ID was the largest security measure that actually affected the voter. We passed an election security bill, but we were very adamant after voter ID, and folks are really getting good about learning it. And by the way, I always want to tell folks, if you know somebody who cannot afford a voter ID, go to your driver's license bureau in any county, and they'll give you one for free, so you have an ID. And we want folks to know that we don't want it to be like a poll tax where you have to buy the ID. They'll give it to you. You sign a form, and they'll give it to you. And what's nice about that is it does prevent me going to your county and voting in your stead with your name because I memorized your information and leaving, then you go to vote after work and they already voted for you or they already voted in your spot. So let's stop that. But we don't want to put any more burden on the voters. So a lot of our security measures or security equipment, making sure that, there's a security tab on envelopes if you do advanced mail ballots to make sure. And we also put on our website, it's sos.ks.gov. You can click to make sure your advanced mail ballot was actually received and processed. Now, a lot of folks think that's for all voting, but that's only for advanced mail ballots. We'd like folks to know if it's getting close to election time and you don't see your ballot showed up at the county clerk's office, you might want to give them a call. But so that's some of the things we do to make sure things are secure. We don't let the poll book talk to voting machines if you're voting in person or early in advanced voting, because we don't want your name tied to the ballot you end up putting in the tabulator. And the other thing Kansas does is every county has paper ballot voter verification. So while we have an image of the ballot, what's really counted is a sheet of paper. And so when you're done voting, you can look at that sheet of paper and make sure it printed off exactly what you wanted it to. And if there's something that doesn't look right, they'll destroy it and give you another chance to correct it. So those are just some of the things we do, but we always want it to be in the circumstance that if we pass the law this year, the way you vote next year is not going to change. We want to keep it the same.
Gotcha. And so that is something that is really, it's really important to note that there's a paper ballot that's attached to, even if you go in and touch the screens.
Correct. And that was an initiative we put, and then we ended up putting in law. There was one county that had the old DRE machines, but they sold them out because they were being phased out. And so once it was done, we don't want anybody going back. And it kind of dampers or rumors of people saying, well, that machine's changing my vote. It's not, because you are holding your vote. So when you go to vote on a touch screen, which a lot of counties have, there's a stick in the back of that machine. And so that stick tells us, it tabulates votes on that machine. And when at the end of the election, after 7 o'clock and everybody's had a chance to vote, they put that in a computer just to populate our website. So when you're at home trying to see who's won your local elections, right, that's what that is. But that is not certified. That is just a temperature. It's not a thermostat. Your ballot is a thermostat. That's what's really going to determine where the election goes. That goes into a tabulator and it gets scanned. Folks say you can't hack a sheet of paper, which is true, but you can spill coffee on it. You can burn it. You can blow it up if there's a terrorist attack. It's always nice to have that digital backup in case for some reason a bunch of ballots were destroyed, to make sure your vote gets counted. And so those are that kind of puts down some of the rumors of like, well, are they changing my vote? No, because you can look at it. It's in your hand.
And you touched on it. I mean, it's something that's sort of later on in my questions, but I'll talk about it now, because you talked about this idea at the end of the day at 7, once the lines are down, election results come out.
Right. I
know that there has been much chatter, much discussion, much confusion. So, this is your chance to sort of talk about this idea of, well, why isn't it done at 7 p.m. on election day? Or we'll give you till 9, right? We'll give you till 9. Why isn't it done? This idea, I know that I've heard in the news, people are very upset because whatever the vote tally is, like, let's give it to 7:05 on election night. There's a certain account. There's a certain guess of how many people have voted. But then if you give it 3 days, 5 days, the numbers change.
Correct.
And often, there have been cases where people who thought that they were winning no longer were winning, or people who thought that they were losing find out that they have won. Why does that happen? Why do the numbers change?
There's a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's provisional ballots, and Kansas does do a lot of provisional ballots because, if you go to a pharmacy.
Can you explain that? Because
I'll get to that here in just a minute, what that is. But if you go to a pharmacy and the insurance denies your prescription, how does that feel when you say, yeah, you're denied? We don't want voters going to a polling place and saying they're being denied. But let's say something doesn't look like we don't have the address there right. Or, you know what, you're voting in the wrong polling place. So we're going to give you a provisional ballot. Now, the governor's race, the secretary of state's race, attorney general, that all is going to be the same no matter where in that county you vote. But maybe the state representative race is different. That portion of that ballot may not count if you vote in the wrong polling place. And we always tell folks, your ballot is your responsibility. Treat it like cash. Make sure it gets counted by showing up at the polling place and have a plan to vote. So if there's an error for some reason, or for example, I'm Scott Schwab. Let's say I have a son named Scott Schwab Jr. What if they accidentally gave my son my ballot and I got my son's? It's provisional, and then they can switch them when the county canvass meets. And that's why some totals change, because they're provisional ballots, but then they determine later, yes, everything was fine. It was the volunteer had an error, and we want to make sure that vote gets counted.
Right.
We also get advanced mail ballot after election day. And so in a lot of advanced mail ballots don't get counted till the next day because they're so busy trying to administer election day. Those ballots aren't going to change. They can administer those the next day. Kansas also has an interesting rule. We have a 3-day grace period because the post office eliminated a lot of processing centers. Then Secretary Chris Kobach made a negotiated bipartisan bill with Democrat election or county clerk out of Douglas County, Jamie Hsu, to say, well, let's just have a 3-day grace period because you can't have it too long because those counties still have to certify their election. So it was 3 days that it can show up as long as it was postmarked before the election. It can show up at the clerk's office because in Southwest Kansas, your ballot goes all the way to Santa Fe, New Mexico before it shows back up at the county clerk's office. Or if you're in Kansas City, Kansas, or sometimes Topeka, your ballot goes all the way to Missouri. So ballots are leaving the state. So they wanted to make sure they had enough time for these processes to come in. And then also we have military ballots that come in. So when folks say, well, why is an election day election day? Well, it's because provisionals. You can't just eliminate those. That's against the Help America Vote Act. You have military. I'm not going to tell the military their ballot's not going to work. We want to get those ballots in. And I respect the 3-day grace rule, whether it's 3 days, 2 days. That's a policy decision by the legislature. But that's why those things change. And then the next week, the County Board of Canvassers meet. Any provisional ballot that doesn't look quite right, they vote on whether or not it should count. And sometimes it's as simple as they marked their ballot, but they didn't mark it right. Was that an errant mark, or were they trying to vote for that person? You know, sometimes on ballots in Western Kansas, you use a pen and you circle in the oval like we did on our tests when we were in high school and junior high. The ballots like that. Well, some people just draw a line through it. Okay, well, were you trying to just do that? Because the other ones are full, but this one has a line through it. We don't know how to interpret that. So they vote on whether those change. That's what then changes the votes again. And then they print it off and they certify it. They all agree these are the numbers we're submitting to the Secretary of State's office. And then they send that to us. And then last week with Governor Kelly and Attorney General Schmidt and myself, I chair the committee, the State Board of Canvassers meets and we accept all the counties. And that's the end of the election. And then I think there's like 8 days that candidates can contest what we certified in court. And we agree that the court system is part of the election process. If you do feel like you were slighted, you should be allowed to go to the court and get their judicial opinion on that.
Okay. So, but just because numbers change, and I feel like this is something that I think it's worth saying, just because numbers change over the course of that initial 3 days, and would potentially numbers change at the end of 3 days and then to the canvas? I guess you're curing ballots. You're still going through.
We're still curing ballots. Those once that election day's on Tuesday, Friday, whatever mail they get, that's the end of the mail ballots. If one shows up on Saturday or 6 months later, we sometimes have to have it. They can't count.
Right.
And then the Board of Canvassers are looking through a lot of significant ballots and it takes all day.
And that's a county level process.
Correct.
Right.
And they vote. And this is where elected officials, your county commissioners, it matters because they might say this ballot counts here, but it could be the exact same error in Sedgwick County and they say it doesn't. So that's where our office is really trying to communicate with those county clerks. This is how you do it. This should be the standard. So if a vote is cast in Wyandotte County, it should count the same as a vote counted in Sedgwick or Kearney.
Okay, that's interesting. So is there like a standard of like best practices of if it's a line that counts or if a line that doesn't count?
So we don't get that specific.
Right.
It really comes down to, and part of it's federal law and also it's court. If you can clearly determine the intent of the voter, it should count. Okay. Well, that's a big game, but a lot of folks, they fill out their ballots different ways, and it's sometimes just kind of hard. But they are instructed if you can tell ballot, if you can tell intent. So, for example, Derek Schmidt's running for governor. What if somebody wrote in Schmidt as a write-in? Well, they didn't write Derek Schmidt.
Yeah, there were a lot of Schmidts on the ballot.
There were a lot of Schmidts on the ballot, especially if you were in the 2nd district, you had a bonus Schmidt. But that was some of the things that some of these clerks have to determine. It's like, well, it just says Schmidt for governor, they wrote in, but that could be their next door neighbor, Thomas Schmidt.
Right.
So is that a legitimate vote for Derek? That's what those are some of the type of decisions that the county board of canvassers have to decide.
Do the county board of canvassers? I know I live in Johnson County as well, and so I know that there's some procedure where they check signatures, and they'll even contact people saying, "Hey, your signature is wrong." Yep. Do you ever contact people for things like? Obviously, if someone writes in Donald Duck, that's not you.
No,
I didn't
interrupt.
But yeah, like especially this year, right? If someone just writes in Schmidt. 1, there were several Schmidts on the ballot. 2, how do you know it's not a valid Tom Schmidt, my next door neighbor is trying to get on? Do they contact to clear those up?
No, because then we would know how they voted. And the Constitution is clear. We have private ballots. So once we realize it's a provisional ballot and why, we get rid of the provisional ballot envelope and we mix them up. And then they go before the board of canvassers. That way it's not tied to the voter. Folks do know that they have a provisional ballot. They're told if they have a provisional ballot, and it's up to them to rectify that.
Gotcha.
Or their caregiver. Like I have a mother-in-law that she needs help. And so It's our business and her business to make sure she gets her vote counted correctly.
So what are your thoughts on mail-in balloting? Or it'll be 2 questions. Mail-in balloting is one, and then early in-person balloting are 2 different ways.
Yeah, so we have basically 3 ways to vote in Kansas: Election Day, advance by mail, and then early in-person voting. I really do like having the 3 ways. I don't want to change it. I've had to mail ballot one time because I had COVID, and I'm like, I'm not going in that polling place. I'm just going to get an advance mail ballot and then make sure my ballot gets counted. We've had mail ballots in Kansas going back to the Civil War, because we wanted to make sure soldiers were able to vote, even though they were at war. And Kansas has always been kind of more of a pro-voter, like how do we help for various folks to vote? And in Kansas, you have to apply, except for certain circumstances, always apply for a ballot if you want mail ballot. This helps us in a lot of ways. We want to make sure it improves data. Oh, wait a minute, your address on your application doesn't match where you're registered to vote. We need to call and rectify that because they may need to re-register. The other thing that we need to do is we do signature verification. The clerks get training with the FBI and the KBI on that. And then we do have voter ID. And I like the voter ID better than the signature because the signature can still be subjective. But when they have their driver's license or their government ID number on that tab, I know that ballot belongs to that voter, and then we can discard the envelope and process the ballot. And again, we don't want to tie that ballot to that voter. So I really think we have a great process. The only thing I don't like is the mail portion of advance mail ballots. Like I said, a lot of ballots leave the state. Once you give it to the post office, they do some election training, but we've had ballots that were legally cast in the mail that showed up over a year late.
Yeah.
And so it's better. We always encourage, and it's been a controversial stance, but I think the election says by and large, people like them. Put them in the drop box.
Right.
The security is handled by your neighbors. They're more secure than a post office. You don't have to pay for a stamp. You can just drop it off, and you can put that advanced mail ballot at any polling place on election day in your county. So the way we do it, I have no problem with it. I think it's great, and it accommodates. I got a friend of mine. He had a severe stroke. He's now a quadriplegic, but he wants to vote, and his wife can allow to help him vote, but he can't go drive to drop off his ballot. So they put it in the mail. It's the only option he has.
Now I know there were quite a few bills that were making their way through the Kansas legislature last year dealing with ballot drop boxes and how many per county and how many per residence. Would they be monitored? How many ballots can someone turn in? There was much legislation that wound its way through. Some of it passed, some of it didn't. Do you have any ideas about all the just drop boxes in general? You just said that.
So yeah, no bill that came into the lexicon of drop boxes passed last year. So that was good. Some folks wanted to put a population tie to it, but again, I don't think that should be determined by Topeka. That should be determined by the county, because they know what they do and they do not need. Wyandotte County could use more drop boxes, but they're a very dense populated area in part of there. So you might need like 3 drop boxes right next to each other. Well, does that make sense? Even though they're densely populated. So let that county determine, because Topeka is not going to understand that as well as Mr. Abbott would in Wyandotte County. So none of those bills passed. We did try to get a bill to allow us to regulate. That way, if we get a new clerk and they just, forgot to secure the drop box to the concrete. Well, now there's regulations that they can actually go through. And we gave guidelines, but again, it's non-binding because we didn't have true authority. We just, hey, here's what you should do to make sure people feel confident with that drop box.
Now, in-person early voting, because I know that's available.
Yes.
Is that all throughout the entire state? I know it's available in Johnson County.
It is. Now, when they start, it kind of depends on the resources. Johnson County starts, I think, the next day after the voter registration stops. Some counties can go a week or two, but eventually all counties do have advanced in-person voting. And I do like it because on election day, first off, some folks are, they've scheduled a vacation. They didn't even think about it being election day, because if I'm going to Hawaii, I'm not thinking about the election. I'm thinking about going to Hawaii or wherever you're going. And it's a great opportunity for that. My son, he's going to college up at Atchison at Benedictine. So for him to be able to come home on a Saturday and be able to go vote and go back up to school because he plays baseball, it's hard for him to get home on a Tuesday when he has class. So he's able, but he likes to go in and vote in person. He's 19. This is the second election he's been able to vote in. And I also want to make sure he's voting for his dad. Yeah. but, I do like it because it's such a convenience. And here's what really helps with the early advanced voting is it shortens the lines on election day.
Right.
I remember in the 2020 election, Jackson County, there were folks waiting 3 hours to vote.
Yeah.
And then they said, well, I think it was channel 4, channel 5, or 9. I can't remember which. I can't see. So, and here we are in Johnson County, like, that's completely different. We got 4 machines over here just waiting for voters to show up. And we had record turnout, no lines, because we dispersed that voting population over several days before the election started.
Right. I know with my friends, I always encourage people to vote early in person, or to take the ballot in if they have mail-in ballots, to take the ballots in or drop them in one of the drop boxes.
Thank you.
A part of it is to alleviate the pressure of poll workers and election officials on the day, because everything can be counted ahead of time. And I do want to bring that up, because I know that, again, election workers and poll workers, election officials, and poll workers have come under increasing pressures and stresses with the big lie. Right. And people who are election deniers. I know that it's been an issue everywhere. It's been an issue around the state, around the country, and in Kansas. Is there anything that your office is doing specifically to either recruit or train? Is it an issue of even protecting the people who are serving as election officers or poll workers?
That's a great question. So it's a difficult line to walk. Let me start with the training. We're always pushing more training, because the better trained you are, the less chance for an error. Most mistakes, all mistakes that we've experienced since we were first sworn in 2019, if there was a mistake, it was an administrative error or a poll worker just wasn't trained. Nobody goes to college to study elections.
Right.
These people are volunteers and they're volunteering their time. And we've been, during COVID, it was fantastic, the number of folks, especially young people. You can be as young as 16 and be able to be a poll worker. And if you go to sos.ks.gov, click on the elections tab. You can sign up to be a poll worker. And it's kind of neat. Sometimes you have a grandma and a granddaughter that's 16. They're working together at a polling place, which is fantastic. But we do see increased pressure in people being less gracious with volunteers, which is really too bad. It should not be. And, we don't want violence. We don't want people walking around with guns at polling places. But the other side is, I don't want cops just driving around a polling place either, because we know how that was used in Dallas County, Alabama, back during the 60s. So it's a very difficult line to walk. A lot of our metro areas were pretty good about having ununiformed police officers in the area. But we didn't want a police car parked outside. It sends a message. We don't want folks to be intimidated. If you just got your voting rights restored because you were released from prison and you're now completely free, and this is your first time voting, there's a cop car there that's gonna be like, you're just gonna be a stigma, like, oh my gosh, I better not vote because I just don't want to go back. We want to make sure it's comfortable and nobody knows what your past is. You can just go and you can vote. It's your business. You go cast your vote, your civic duty. But then now is that a security risk for poll workers? This last time it's not, but normally where the hate comes is on the head clerks, their phones, they get threats and stuff, and they report that and deal with that mostly within the county. But it's just too bad. I'm really, if you go vote, while you're voting, thank the volunteers. I just thank every one of them. Hey, thank you for volunteering today. And in Johnson County, my son, when he voted for the first time, they didn't know he was my son. We tried to be a little bit more incognito. And they said, hey, everybody in the room, we got a first-time voter, and everybody applauds. It's like, I kind of get choked up. Like, this is really cool, the encouragement of it. And so if we can kind of keep more of that attitude in our polling places, as opposed to the nefarious ideas that there's this great system making sure your vote doesn't count. We've showed through the recounts and all our post-election audits, there's no systemic fraud. And it's fascinating to me. I already have people accusing me that Derek Schmidt, he lost because of fraud. I'm like, no, he certified his own loss.
Right.
He signed it. He's okay with it. But nobody's complaining that there was voter fraud when we get the first Republican elected in Wyandotte County since like 1983. So we really need to have an honest look at where our resources that are spreading rumors about elections. And we always tell folks, go be a poll worker. You'll see the security, the number of converts we had where they were really concerned about security of elections. And then they actually worked an election like, oh, wow, there's a lot of layers of security here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing it's always been interesting to me about the voter fraud allegations in Kansas coming from certain people where I'm like, well, then if there was voter fraud, wouldn't there be different people in office? I don't know. It's just
and this is what we got a lot of legislators that really believe there's systemic fraud. And I said, you can contest your own election. There was a Western Kansas legislator. She swore she won her primary, and we did a hand count, and nothing changed. The value of them both on the constitutional amendment during the primary, a gentleman was manipulated and put $120,000 on his credit card. Nothing changed.
For the recount, yeah.
For the recount. He's got to pay that off. I mean, because we ran it. We didn't put a hold on it. We ran it because the law says we have to have that so we can reimburse the counties for the recount. And our phones really rang a lot less after that recount. It was almost eerily quiet because they've been ringing so much the past few years. But it kind of just put an exclamation point like, no, we kind of get it right. And sometimes the issue or the person you want to win doesn't.
Gotcha. Let me see, go back to my little agenda of things I wanted to try to make sure I asked you. And we only have a couple minutes left here. Okay. Now there is some chat going in the comment section, and the only one I think I'm going to ask you about is any voter data being held here, or does it go out of the country? I will ask.
We keep it here, and we own it, and it's in a very secure location that I'm not going to tell because I don't need the whole world knowing where we keep our data, but it is incredibly secure. When President Obama made elections critical infrastructure, we ended up getting security, and I was actually the first Secretary of State to get top secret clearance because we just need that intel. And it's not so much domestic as it is foreign, but there are some domestic concerns. Our folks always talk about, oh, what about the voting machines? That's where it's at. No, that's not my concern. My biggest concern is voter data. And that's where I really want to make sure we have IT security, that everybody knows process and how they have access to that. So if they have to change an address, or, the way we do it in Kansas, if you move from Shawnee County to Johnson County, the moment you register to vote in Johnson County, you come off Shawnee County. That prevents double voting, which is a good thing. And so to do that process, we have to make sure it's secure. And no, it is all domestic. We have it. And we record every keystroke. We have ever since we created the system. So if someone goes in and they type the name and they realize, oh, it's Stacy with a CEY, not a CI, and they hit backspace, we record the backspace. We know who's in that system and what they typed and when to make sure it's secure.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, we have about a minute left. Is there anything, if there's anything that you wish the general public could know, right? You and I, you've heard probably more whispers than I have, right? Having been involved in an election and been involved in campaigns, everyone has thoughts and opinions. Is there anything that you wish the general public knew?
Your vote counts. It's yours. The one thing since taking this role, I noticed more important than ever before is your ballot is your responsibility. Folks that are concerned about voter fraud, well, then you cast your ballot. You do it. Folks that are worried about voter suppression, have someone go with you and make sure you are protected. We take both threats very seriously. I think we want voting to be a pleasant experience. But if someone's going to say, hey, can I turn in your advance mail ballot for you? They need to fill out that security envelope. I would encourage you to take a picture of it. That way, if your ballot doesn't show up, you at least know who was supposed to turn it in and they can be held accountable. Because the one thing we can't control is if someone picks up 10 ballots and they throw them away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's why we put that on our website so you can track your ballot. Again, our website is sos.ks.gov. Under the elections tab, you can apply to be a poll worker. And it's always just a good resource to know who it is in your county you should reach out to if you need help.
All right. I've dropped the website in the chat a couple times. So thank you again. I want to thank you, Secretary Scott Schwab, for coming on and talking about elections in general and how elections are run in the state of Kansas. I do appreciate you taking this time and talking to our audience.
Oh, honored to do it. Thank you, Stacy. You have a wonderful Christmas.
All right. You as well. All right, everyone. We'll see you next week.